The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of eastern Afghanistan as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet and performed her final pre-flight checks on her A-10 Thunderbolt II aircraft. The date was March 15, 2019, and what started as a routine close air support mission would soon become one of the most dangerous and heroic rescue operations in modern military history. Captain Mitchell had been flying combat missions for 3 years, earning respect among ground forces for her precision strikes and unwavering dedication to protecting troops below. Her A-10, nicknamed Warthog by pilots for its ungainly appearance but devastating firepower, was perfectly suited for close ground support missions. The aircraft's 30mm Gu-8 cannon could tear through enemy positions, while its armored cockpit could withstand significant damage. That morning, intelligence reports indicated moderate Taliban activity in the Kunar province, where a special operations team was conducting a high-priority mission. Navy SEAL Team 6 had been inserted 3 days earlier to capture or eliminate a high-value target believed to be coordinating attacks against coalition forces. The operation, codenamed Iron Wolf, was supposed to be a quick in-and-out mission lasting no more than 48 hours. Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison led the 381-man Special Operations Force, consisting of Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and Delta Force operators. They had successfully located their target in a remote village nestled between steep mountain ridges. The compound sat in a valley surrounded by high ground, making it tactically challenging but providing multiple escape routes for the team. As Captain Mitchell's A-10 soared through the clear morning sky, her radio crackled with routine communications from ground control. She was assigned to provide overwatch for the extraction of Iron Wolf team, which was scheduled to begin at 800 hours. 2 CH-47 Chinook helicopters were en route to the designated landing zone, with Mitchell providing aerial security during the pickup operation. The first sign of trouble came at 0745 hours, when Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice cut through the radio static with unusual urgency. His team had successfully completed their primary objective, but something was wrong. Local Taliban commanders had apparently anticipated the operation and had been moving fighters into position throughout the night. What the SEALs didn't know was that they were walking into the largest Taliban ambush in the region's history. Morrison's voice was calm but tense as he reported movement on the ridgelines surrounding their position. Thermal imaging revealed dozens of heat signatures taking positions among the rocks and caves that dotted the mountainsides. The enemy had chosen their battlefield perfectly, using the natural terrain to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the valley into a killing zone. Captain Mitchell immediately altered her flight pattern, diving lower to get a better view of the situation below. Through her targeting system, she could see the SEAL team's position marked by infrared strobes, visible only through night vision equipment. The Special Operations Forces had taken cover in a cluster of mud brick buildings at the valley floor, but their position was rapidly becoming untenable. The Taliban attack began with a single rocket-propelled grenade that screamed across the valley and exploded against a compound wall, showering the SEALs with debris and dust. Within seconds, the entire mountainside erupted with muzzle flashes as hundreds of enemy fighters opened fire from concealed positions. The distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles mixed with the deeper boom of heavy machine guns and the whistle of incoming mortars. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team immediately returned fire, but they were severely outnumbered and surrounded on 3 sides. The fourth side of the valley led to an open plain where the extraction helicopters were supposed to land, but that route was now covered by enemy snipers positioned on high ground. The Chinooks would be sitting ducks if they attempted to land under these conditions. Morrison quickly assessed the tactical situation and made the difficult decision to call off the helicopter extraction. His voice was steady despite the chaos around him as he radioed the incoming aircraft, ordering them to abort their landing and return to base. The sound of automatic weapons fire was clearly audible in the background as he spoke, punctuated by explosions from enemy grenades and mortars. The SEAL commander knew his team was in serious trouble. They were carrying limited ammunition for a short-duration mission, and they were already taking casualties from the intense enemy fire. Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, the team's medic, was treating multiple wounded operators while trying to stay low behind crumbling walls that provided minimal protection from the incoming rounds. Captain Mitchell watched the unfolding disaster from above, her hands gripping the flight controls as she struggled with the limited options available to her. Standard operating procedures required her to maintain minimum altitude restrictions to avoid ground fire, but the enemy positions were scattered among civilian buildings and rocky terrain that made precision strikes extremely difficult without risking civilian casualties. The Taliban fighters had clearly planned this ambush for weeks, if not months. They had pre-positioned weapons caches, established overlapping fields of fire, and even prepared secondary positions to fall back to if necessary. Intelligence later revealed that enemy commanders had been intercepting coalition communications and had anticipated the special operations mission. As the firefight intensified, Morrison's team began running low on ammunition. The SEALs were trained to make every shot count, but they were facing a determined enemy that seemed to have unlimited manpower and supplies. Enemy fighters would emerge from hidden positions, fire a few rounds, then disappear back into the caves and crevices that honeycomb the Afghan mountains. The situation grew more desperate with each passing minute. The team's radio operator, Petty Officer First Class David Kim, was coordinating with various command centers, trying to arrange alternate extraction methods or additional air support. However, the nearest coalition forces were hours away, and weather conditions were deteriorating rapidly as afternoon thunderstorms moved into the area. Captain Mitchell could see Taliban reinforcements arriving from multiple directions, using motorcycles and pickup trucks to transport fighters and ammunition to positions around the trapped SEALs. Enemy mortar teams were adjusting their fire, walking explosions closer to the American position with each salvo. Several buildings in the compound had already been severely damaged, reducing the available cover for Morrison's men. The young pilot had trained for situations like this, but the reality of watching elite warriors fighting for their lives below was unlike anything she had experienced. Every instinct told her to dive down and strafe the enemy positions, but her orders were clear: maintain altitude, avoid unnecessary risks, and wait for additional air support assets to arrive on station. Morrison's voice came over the radio again, this time with a formal request for immediate close air support. His tone was professional, but Mitchell could hear the strain in his voice as he provided coordinates for enemy positions. The SEAL commander was requesting danger-close strikes, meaning the bombs and cannon fire would be landing within 200 meters of friendly forces. Captain Mitchell acknowledged the request and began her attack run, but as she descended toward the valley, her aircraft was immediately engaged by enemy anti-aircraft fire. Streams of tracer rounds arced up toward her A-10, and she could hear the distinctive crack of bullets passing close to her aircraft. The Taliban had brought heavy weapons to this fight, including 23mm anti-aircraft guns that could seriously damage even her armored aircraft. Banking sharply to avoid the ground fire, Mitchell climbed back to a safer altitude while reassessing the situation. The enemy had effectively created a no-fly zone around the valley, using overlapping anti-aircraft positions to prevent close air support. Any aircraft that descended low enough to make accurate strikes would be vulnerable to enemy fire. The SEAL team's situation was becoming increasingly desperate. They had been under continuous fire for over 2 hours, and their ammunition supplies were running critically low. Several team members had been wounded, and the enemy was beginning to maneuver closer to their position. Taliban fighters were using smoke grenades to conceal their movement as they attempted to flank the American position from multiple directions. A-10 Sarah Mitchell circled high above the valley, her mind racing as she watched the desperate battle unfolding below. The radio chatter from various command centers filled her headset with conflicting information and bureaucratic delays that seemed divorced from the life-and-death struggle happening on the ground. Higher headquarters was still debating rules of engagement, while 381 elite warriors were fighting for their survival against overwhelming odds. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice cut through the radio traffic with increasing urgency. His team had been forced to consolidate into an even smaller defensive perimeter as Taliban fighters continued to advance under cover of smoke and coordinated suppressing fire. The enemy was employing sophisticated tactics, using diversionary attacks to mask their main assault from the eastern ridge line, where they had positioned their heaviest weapons. The SEAL medic, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, was now treating 8 seriously wounded operators in a makeshift aid station set up in the basement of a partially collapsed building. The casualties included 2 men with severe shrapnel wounds from mortar strikes and several others with bullet wounds to their extremities. Rodriguez was running low on medical supplies and blood clotting agents, working frantically to stabilize the wounded, while enemy fire continued to rain down on their position. Captain Mitchell could see the tactical situation deteriorating with each passing minute. Through her targeting pod, she observed Taliban fighters moving through a network of irrigation ditches and low stone walls that provided concealment as they approached the SEAL position. The enemy had clearly studied this terrain extensively and was using every piece of cover to their advantage. The weather was also becoming a factor as dark clouds gathered over the mountains, bringing the threat of thunderstorms that would ground all aircraft and eliminate any possibility of extraction or resupply. Afghan weather patterns in the spring were notoriously unpredictable, and meteorologists were forecasting severe storms that could last for hours. Morrison's communications became more urgent as his team's ammunition reached critical levels. The SEALs were down to their last few magazines of rifle ammunition, and their machine gunners were rationing bursts to conserve what little they had left. The team's explosives expert had already used most of their grenades to keep enemy fighters at bay during the initial assault. At 1200 hours, the situation took another turn for the worse when enemy reinforcements arrived in the form of a technical vehicle mounted with a heavy machine gun. The pickup truck positioned itself on high ground overlooking the SEAL position and began raking their defensive perimeter with devastating fire. The heavy weapon could penetrate the mud brick walls that provided the Americans' only protection. Captain Mitchell watched in horror as the enemy machine gun forced Morrison's team to abandon several defensive positions and crowd into an even smaller area. The Taliban fighters immediately recognized this tactical advantage and began massing for what appeared to be a final assault on the American position. The pilot's frustration reached a breaking point as she listened to radio communications from various command centers. Intelligence officers were debating the presence of civilians in the target area. Legal advisors were discussing rules of engagement, and logistics coordinators were calculating fuel loads for potential rescue missions. Meanwhile, elite warriors who had dedicated their lives to protecting America were being systematically destroyed by an enemy that showed no such restraint. Morrison's voice came over the radio with a formal request that sent chills through everyone listening. The SEAL commander was requesting immediate evacuation of his wounded personnel, followed by close air support to cover the withdrawal of his remaining forces. It was a desperate plan that would require extraordinary courage and precision, but it was their only chance of survival. Captain Mitchell knew that any rescue attempt would require her to descend well below minimum safe altitude and fly directly through the enemy's anti-aircraft fire. Her A-10 was tough, but it wasn't invincible, and the Taliban had demonstrated their ability to engage aircraft with accurate fire. Previous attempts to provide close air support had been driven off by intense ground fire. The pilot made a decision that would define the rest of her military career. Ignoring direct orders to maintain safe altitude and wait for additional support, Captain Mitchell pushed her throttles forward and dove toward the valley floor. Her aircraft screamed downward through layers of anti-aircraft fire as enemy gunners tracked her movement and opened up with everything they had. Tracer rounds streaked past her canopy like deadly fireworks as Mitchell lined up her first attack run on the enemy machine gun position. The A-10's targeting system locked onto the technical vehicle, and she squeezed the trigger on her 30mm cannon. The massive gun unleashed a torrent of depleted uranium rounds that tore the enemy vehicle apart in a shower of sparks and flame. The pilot immediately pulled up and banked hard to the left, avoiding a stream of anti-aircraft fire that followed her across the sky. Her aircraft shook from the turbulence of near-miss explosions, but the armored cockpit protected her from the worst of the enemy fire. The distinctive sound of the A-10's cannon had an immediate psychological effect on both friendly and enemy forces below. Morrison's voice came over the radio with barely contained relief as he reported that the enemy machine gun had been neutralized. However, their situation was still desperate as Taliban fighters continued to advance from multiple directions. The SEAL commander provided coordinates for additional enemy positions that were threatening his perimeter. Captain Mitchell began a series of attack runs that would later be described as some of the most dangerous close air support missions ever flown. She repeatedly dove through intense anti-aircraft fire to deliver precision strikes within meters of friendly forces. Each attack run required split-second timing and extraordinary flying skills to avoid both enemy fire and civilian casualties. The pilot's radio crackled with increasingly urgent communications from her command center, ordering her to abort her attack runs and return to minimum safe altitude. Her squadron commander's voice was sharp with authority as he reminded her of standing orders and the potential consequences of disobeying direct commands during combat operations. Mitchell acknowledged the orders, but continued her attack runs, knowing that abandoning the SEAL team at this critical moment would result in their complete annihilation. She had made a conscious decision to prioritize the lives of the warriors below over her own career and personal safety. The pilot understood that her actions would likely result in a court-martial, but she couldn't live with herself if she abandoned these men. Her fourth attack run targeted a group of Taliban fighters who had managed to advance within 50 meters of the SEAL position. The enemy was using a dry creek bed for concealment as they prepared for a final assault that would overrun the American defensive perimeter. Mitchell's cannon fire walked through their position, forcing the survivors to retreat and buying precious time for Morrison's team. The continuous combat flying was taking its toll on both pilot and aircraft. Captain Mitchell's A-10 had sustained multiple hits from enemy fire, with several systems showing damage indicators on her instrument panel. Hydraulic fluid was leaking from damaged lines, and her right engine was running rough after taking shrapnel from an anti-aircraft burst. Despite the mechanical problems, Mitchell continued her attacks, knowing that each pass brought the SEAL team a little more time and hope. Her cannon ammunition was running low, forcing her to make every burst count as she engaged enemy positions with surgical precision. The pilot had trained for years to develop this level of accuracy under combat conditions. On the ground, Lieutenant Commander Morrison was coordinating his team's fighting withdrawal toward a more defensible position near the village center. The SEAL team moved by squads, with one group providing covering fire while another bounded forward to the next position. Their movement was textbook infantry tactics executed under the most extreme combat conditions. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez continued his heroic efforts to treat the wounded while under fire, using his own body to shield casualties from flying debris and shrapnel. The medic had already saved several lives through his quick thinking and medical skills, earning him the respect and gratitude of every man in the unit. Captain Mitchell's fuel gauge was now showing critical levels, forcing her to make increasingly difficult decisions about how to use her remaining attack runs. Each dive through the enemy fire zone consumed precious fuel, and she would soon have to choose between continuing her support mission and having enough fuel to return safely to base. The pilot made another decision that defied military protocol by choosing to remain on station well beyond her safe fuel reserves. She calculated that she could make 2 more attack runs before reaching the point of no return, when her aircraft would lack sufficient fuel to reach the nearest airfield. It was a calculated risk that could cost her life, but she refused to abandon the SEAL team in their darkest hour. Captain Sarah Mitchell's fuel warning lights flashed red as she prepared for what might be her final attack run. Her A-10 had absorbed significant damage from enemy fire, with multiple system failures cascading across her instrument panel. Hydraulic pressure was dropping, her right engine was producing reduced power, and several flight control surfaces were responding sluggishly to her inputs. Below in the valley, Lieutenant Commander Morrison's SEAL team had been compressed into a defensive perimeter no larger than a basketball court. The enemy had surrounded them on 3 sides, with only a narrow escape route leading toward the original landing zone remaining open. However, that route was covered by enemy snipers positioned on the surrounding ridgelines, making movement during daylight hours virtually suicidal. The Taliban fighters had grown bolder as they sensed victory within their grasp. Enemy commanders were coordinating attacks from multiple directions, using handheld radios to synchronize their assault on the American position. Intercepted communications indicated that they knew they were fighting Navy SEALs and were determined to capture prisoners for propaganda purposes. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez had moved the wounded into the basement of the most intact building in their defensive perimeter, but even that shelter was becoming unsafe as enemy mortar rounds continued to impact nearby. The medic was now treating 12 casualties, including several men who had been wounded multiple times during the prolonged firefight. Captain Mitchell dove through the anti-aircraft fire one more time, her cannon blazing as she targeted an enemy mortar position that had been causing heavy casualties among the SEAL team. Her depleted uranium rounds tore through the enemy emplacement, silencing the mortar crew and buying the ground team a brief respite from the devastating indirect fire. As she pulled up from her attack run, Mitchell's aircraft was hit by a burst of 23mm anti-aircraft fire that sent shrapnel tearing through her left wing. Warning lights illuminated across her cockpit as fuel began streaming from damaged tanks, drastically reducing her already critical fuel reserves. The pilot knew she was now well beyond the point of safe return to base. Her radio erupted with urgent transmissions from multiple command centers as word of her situation spread through the chain of command. Squadron commanders, air traffic controllers, and rescue coordinators were all trying to coordinate emergency landing options while demanding that she immediately break off her attack runs and head for the nearest airfield. Captain Mitchell ignored the radio traffic and focused on the tactical situation below. Through her targeting system, she could see Taliban fighters massing for what appeared to be a coordinated assault from 2 directions. The enemy had learned to time their attacks to coincide with her climb-outs, when she was unable to provide immediate fire support to the beleaguered SEAL team. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's voice cut through the radio chatter with a situation report that painted a grim picture of their circumstances. His team was down to less than 50 rounds of ammunition per man. They had no grenades or explosives remaining, and several of their weapons had been damaged by enemy fire. The SEAL commander estimated they could hold their position for perhaps another 30 minutes before being overrun. The weather situation was also deteriorating rapidly as the predicted thunderstorms moved into the area. Dark clouds were building over the mountains, bringing the threat of lightning, heavy rain, and high winds that would make flying extremely dangerous. Once the storms arrived, no aircraft would be able to operate in the area for hours. Mitchell made a split-second decision that would be debated in military circles for years to come. Instead of using her remaining fuel to attack enemy positions from altitude, she chose to land her damaged A-10 in the valley and fight alongside the SEAL team on the ground. It was an unprecedented decision that violated every rule of air-to-ground combat operations. The pilot keyed her radio and informed Morrison of her intentions, asking him to mark a suitable landing area near their defensive perimeter. The SEAL commander was initially stunned by her proposal, as no one had ever attempted to land a jet aircraft in such a confined combat zone under enemy fire. However, he quickly recognized that her aircraft carried additional ammunition and medical supplies that could make the difference between survival and annihilation. Captain Mitchell lined up her approach on a relatively flat section of the valley floor, dodging enemy fire as she prepared for the most challenging landing of her career. Her damaged aircraft was handling poorly, with reduced hydraulic pressure affecting her flight controls and making precise maneuvering extremely difficult. The landing area was littered with rocks, debris, and shell craters that could easily cause her aircraft to crash. Taliban fighters immediately recognized what was happening and concentrated their fire on the approaching A-10, hoping to shoot down the aircraft before it could land. Tracer rounds filled the air around Mitchell's aircraft as enemy gunners adjusted their aim, trying to hit the jet's engines or control surfaces to cause a catastrophic crash. The pilot fought to control her damaged aircraft as she touched down hard on the rocky ground, her landing gear absorbing tremendous impact forces as she bounced and skidded across the uneven terrain. Sparks flew from her wheels as they scraped against rocks, and her aircraft lurched violently from side to side as she struggled to maintain directional control. Mitchell brought her A-10 to a stop less than 100 meters from the SEAL defensive perimeter, immediately shutting down her engines and preparing to abandon her aircraft. She grabbed her survival rifle, extra ammunition, and first aid supplies before climbing out of the cockpit under heavy enemy fire. Bullets sparked off her aircraft's armor as she sprinted toward the SEAL position. Lieutenant Commander Morrison's team provided covering fire as their unexpected reinforcement dashed across the open ground, her flight suit and survival gear making her an obvious target for enemy snipers. Several SEALs left their positions to help escort the pilot to safety, exposing themselves to additional risk, but ensuring she reached their defensive perimeter alive. The arrival of Captain Mitchell and the supplies she carried from her aircraft had an immediate impact on the team's capabilities and morale. Her survival rifle added another weapon to their defensive arsenal, and the first aid supplies allowed Staff Sergeant Rodriguez to better treat the wounded. More importantly, her presence demonstrated that they had not been abandoned by their own forces. The pilot quickly adapted to ground combat operations, using her training from survival school to effectively engage enemy targets with accurate rifle fire. Her knowledge of the tactical situation from her aerial perspective proved invaluable as she helped Morrison coordinate the team's defensive efforts and identify enemy movement patterns. As the afternoon wore on, the combined SEAL and pilot team began to notice changes in enemy tactics and morale. Taliban fighters were becoming more cautious in their approaches, apparently concerned about taking additional casualties against an enemy that continued to fight so effectively despite being outnumbered and surrounded. The arrival of the thunderstorms brought both challenges and opportunities. Heavy rain reduced visibility and made accurate shooting more difficult for both sides. But it also provided concealment that the Americans could use to their advantage. Lightning strikes and thunder masked the sound of movement, allowing for better tactical repositioning. Captain Mitchell worked with Morrison to develop a plan for fighting their way to a more defensible position where they could hold out until weather conditions improved enough for rescue operations. The plan required precise timing and coordination, using the storm's reduced visibility to mask their movement while maintaining enough firepower to suppress enemy attacks. The breakout began at dusk as the storm reached its peak intensity. Mitchell and two SEALs provided covering fire, while the rest of the team moved in small groups toward their objective. The pilot's accurate rifle fire and tactical knowledge helped suppress enemy positions that might have otherwise detected and engaged the moving team members. The fighting withdrawal took nearly 2 hours as the team leapfrogged from position to position, carrying their wounded and maintaining defensive integrity despite continuous enemy pressure. Mitchell's presence proved crucial during several critical moments when her additional firepower helped break contact with pursuing Taliban fighters. As night fell and the storm began to clear, rescue helicopters finally arrived on station with a full complement of gunships, providing close air support. The extraction was conducted under fire, but the combined team had successfully fought their way to a position where helicopters could safely land and evacuate all personnel. Captain Mitchell was the last person to board the rescue helicopter, ensuring that all wounded SEALs were safely loaded before leaving her abandoned A-10 behind in the valley. Her aircraft was later destroyed by an airstrike to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, but her heroic actions had saved the lives of 381 elite warriors who might otherwise have been lost in one of the war's deadliest ambushes. The aftermath of the operation brought both commendation and controversy. Mitchell faced court-martial proceedings for disobeying direct orders, but the charges were eventually dropped due to the extraordinary circumstances and the lives she had saved. She was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and became one of the most decorated female combat pilots in military history. Lieutenant Commander Morrison and his entire team survived the operation, with all wounded personnel making full recoveries. The mission became a case study in small unit tactics and the importance of close air support in modern warfare. The bond formed between the SEAL team and their unlikely rescuer lasted long after their return from combat, demonstrating the brotherhood that exists among all warriors who have faced death together on the battlefield.